This is my book, Why I Am Not a Hindu Woman. Uh, it actually came out in 2020, and at that time, of course, the lockdown had not yet been lifted. I had started writing it somewhere around 2018, soon after I had retired from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences as Professor of Women's Studies. Um, Earlier, I had not published any book. I have, of course, many articles, both academic and non-academic. I had published 2 books of translation, but I was actually given this as an assignment by the publisher, Women Unlimited, which was one of the the publishers of Kali for Women, which was an older feminist publisher, then parted ways, and Women Unlimited was one of them. The publisher, Ritu Menon, who's a feminist herself, of course, wanted a woman's take on this kind of topic on which many people had written. Kancha Ilaya being one of the most famous, who wrote Why I'm Not a Hindu from a Bahujan point of view. And the idea is that the Hindu Dharma, not even in its political form, but in its normally practiced form, according to the religious Shastras, has many misogynistic elements in it. And that's why the idea was to bring out a feminist take on this. But when I started writing it, the entire political situation in the country also became important, because a right-wing regime had come to power in 2014. And by 2018, the kind of actions being taken had also come into focus. And there was every day some news. I mean, it might not always be to do with women. It might be to do with the suppression of some democratic freedoms concerning others. But there were also many things related to women that were going on at that time. For example, the whole question of temple entry to women and protests on those lines. That was one of the issues. And this seemed to be a regime which was not very friendly to women, definitely. And the kind of Hindutva which was being promoted emphasized and underlined the misogynistic elements of the Hindu Dharma. So then it was a question of structuring the book. I started off with an introduction about why I was writing this, and locating myself as somebody with left-wing views and atheist, who also recognized that Hinduism is not just misogynistic, but also incorporates a caste hierarchy as a basic element of its structure. And I had come into contact with various aspects of the caste system because I lived for many years and taught in the university at Aurangabad, which, as people know, had been earlier a part of the Nizam of Hyderabad's province. And it had never, that part had not really been a part of much of the freedom struggle and the various emancipating forces of that time. So we find that this was within the state of Maharashtra, a socially and economically backward area, and where caste was definitely rampant. And in a sense, because liberal ideas had not touched so much, people were open about expressing their caste prejudice. Whereas in Western Maharashtra or in Bombay, people would try and pretend that they don't uh, uh, believe in caste. Whereas nobody pretended that in Aurangabad. And I came up with this very stark expression of caste hierarchies. And I thought this would be a part of my book. So after having located myself like that, another thing which I should mention here was about my own writing. And earlier, though I had published in academic journals, and much of my writing was academic in economics and later on caste as well. Earlier, I had written pieces where I talked about my own experiences because I have lived in various parts of the world. In Singapore in my childhood, in England during my high school and university education, then in the backward part of Maharashtra state, and then now, of course, in Bombay. So I wrote about my experiences growing up. I would write about the experience of being married to a poet from the Bahujan class who had in fact, had been a part of a movement against the literary establishment which was very Brahminical during the 60s. This was a famous literary movement in Marathi. And he was also a working class man who lived in the center of the old mill area and had been brought up in one of the working class chawls. So, I had seen many things during my life. We had had many writers staying with us in Singapore. Had come into contact with diplomats from India and their families and so on. So, writing about my own experiences and then reflecting on them in a political sense, basically, as whatever my polity, also a Marxist influence, which is a part of my intellectual formation when I was at Cambridge University. So all these things, they led to a form of writing in which my personal experiences and my outlook on life and my analysis of society were tied together. And this was the way in which this book also was written. This was a more extended version of this genre of writing, you can say. But as I said, there were always things happening which one had to react to. There was the war, there was the whole building up to the 2019 elections. There was a suddenly an atmosphere of war in the country. So then Hindutva was now being tied up with some kind of military aggressiveness. So I had to write about that. But I started off by writing about the Hindu family. Because I think that is where the values of women's subordination, of patriarchy, and also some element of caste was experienced. Because the family locates itself within its caste. The family identifies itself as a part of its caste. And so you have your culinary culture, you have your way of remarking on people of other castes. Mainly it was Brahmins that we came into contact with because we were outside India. But we, not being a small upper caste who are not Brahmins, also had something to say about that. My parents, which I didn't really understand at that time. And then coming into contact with casteism of a different kind later. So the first one was on the family. And I decided also to write about some very personal experiences because my father at a very late stage in marriage. And since I was the last child, I was a young child at that time. He had a long-standing affair with another woman whom he brought into the house. And I thought I would talk about that and also then relate that to how the Manusmriti looks at the woman and her place in the family and the home. Because in a sense she is glorified. It is considered to be important to keep her happy. But the Manusmriti is addressed to an upper caste male householder. And keeping a woman happy also somewhere presumes that she is somewhat empty-headed, pleased by things like gifts and so on. And also, of course, devoted to her husband and to keeping him safe, keeping him healthy, practicing all the rituals that underline her husband's position in the family as the head of the family and so on. So I found this was one way of entering into my subject with the personal part of it all as well. I realized this might be a bit controversial, but I thought that was also an important thing to do because I was an upper caste woman. Because, I find that there have been autobiographies written by Dalit women who have been very frank. I mean, somebody like Urmila Pawar, whose other works I have translated, who was very frank, not just about the caste discrimination she suffered in the village as in childhood, but also contradictions with her husband. And Dalit women have been very frank. And because they are women writing after men wrote autobiographies, talking about misogyny and after all, patriarchy is a feature of our society. There is no reason to expect that it won't exist among Dalits. But I thought that upper caste women tended to be less frank when they wrote about themselves. And maybe this is a generalization, but I thought coming out with certain painful personal things would also add to the kind of writing I was doing in this book. That was the first chapter after the introduction. The second chapter was about war and how war was glorified, and then how the Hindu mythologies and shastras look at war and the just war in the Mahabharata and all that. I think in the third chapter, I turned to something which my publisher was not terribly happy about at first, talking about Hinduism and other religions. Because I had come into contact with Christianity as I was in a Christian boarding school for 2 years. Later on in England, there was a certain amount of religious education in our schools also. Even earlier in Singapore. So a certain amount of reading the Bible, attending Mass in my boarding school. In fact, the years in boarding school brought me close to Christianity. Then, during my days at Cambridge, there were fellow students from Pakistan. And Indians and Pakistanis, of course, not just drifted together, but we were also housed in the same part of the hostel. And we became a kind of community. And in 1971, when the war with Pakistan, the war that liberated Bangladesh was going on, it was very interesting that, this did not cause any kind of rift between us. I thought that was worth writing about, the kind of relationship that we had. They used to observe Ramzan And of course, we used to enjoy the feasts they had at the end of the day, and we would join them in that. Um, so, Islam like that. Then, my elder sister, who married quite late in life, married a Muslim. Of course, he was not, I mean, he was a believer in communism and not very much an upholder of Islam as such. But that also brought, and much more than that, I think living in Aurangabad, where the Muslim culture was still a part of the environment. So, Christians, Muslims, of course, I didn't write about all of this in the book, but I thought it was worth comparing. And all religions tend to be patriarchal. But I found that in the Manusmriti, there is a kind of suspicion, distrust, and even hatred of women, which you don't find so much in the other religions. It is there to some extent. So I wrote about this again with reference to my different experiences. It was only in the chapter after that I came to caste, and there, of course, there is an account of caste. First being oblivious to the fact of caste, living in Singapore, except some things I heard people say. And more of a class experience, maybe. There were Indians in Singapore. There was a Tamil working class who had been brought to the island as indentured labor in earlier days, and they now formed a part of the community. There was also a large Chinese population. Then I talked about being in Aurangabad, the sharp caste divisions that were expressed openly. Then later, my experiences of entering an anti-caste kind of movement. That was really later, after 1990. And in fact, the late 1990s, after my mother was with me for the last days of her life. She moved from Pune to stay with me. And after that, I started going around with some people who considered themselves followers of Marx, Ambedkar, and Phule. And then talking to young people, college students, speaking in shibirs. I learned about caste also from interacting with all these people. And I also tried to argue, I tried to also tell stories, I tried to oppose caste in whatever way I could. Wrote some booklets. And that I have written about in the chapter on caste. And finally, my last chapter is on violence in Hinduism. And for the maintenance of the caste system, violence is necessary. There are two kinds of violence. The violence that erupts when somebody defies the caste order, either through an intercaste marriage or by any kind of self-assertion. So violence on two levels. One, when people assert themselves, especially Dalits or even people of other subordinate castes, assert themselves against the caste hierarchical order. For example, through intercaste marriage, or when Dalits have any kind of public assertion or celebration which is considered to be unacceptable because Dalits are supposed to be always aware of their subordinate status. This violence can be brutal, it can lead to death, murder, mass violence. I won't go into the examples here. But the other kind of violence is a daily violence, where a certain kind of humiliation, which on some levels is ingrained. I mean, now I'm slightly going off the point because not all of these nuances perhaps came into the book. But I wanted to also show that we find in the Ramayana and the Mahabharata uh, examples of violence, which are linked up with the fact that these epics also depict a struggle between different sections of society and how a certain kind of Brahminical order gets established. Yeah. So, anyway, and then the violence when Hinduism is politicized, which we were experiencing, of course, as I was writing that. So that was the end of that. I've also then talked about that daily violence and how that creates, that builds up the psychology of people living under the caste order in different ways for different castes. It is actually also, just as patriarchy is harmful for males, it causes pain, it causes a limitation on the possibilities of life. So, the caste system also, in some ways, is oppressive for the upper caste, especially upper caste women. Anyway, I'll stop there. That was the kind of structure of the book. And through it, I found myself getting into a new mode of writing. When the book was published, actually, it came out when there was still a lockdown. In 21, gradually things opened up. And so there were some discussions, and especially in academic circles. Though there was a group in Kerala, which was a literary group, which contacted me and asked me to discuss my book. Sure. I think the reception has been quite good on the whole. I got some decent reviews in leading newspapers, and some feminist journals or other journals as well. But what I valued most was when young women told me that I had made it possible for them to also write about themselves. There was a generally positive reaction from Dalit Bahujan activists who read the book in English. But then, of course, it could not reach a large number of people who only read in regional languages. There were a few discussions. Maybe there would have been more if we were not just at the end of the lockdown and restarting normal kind of interactions with each other. It was much later that the book was translated into Marathi. Lokwanmay were the publishers who were interested. I had a good rapport with the translators, Shekhar Deshmukh. Again, I am not very good at promoting my book, but I think it has had a good reception in Marathi as well. Not so many reviews, but some positive reactions on Facebook. Yeah. I think it's a book that will be read, and my publisher thinks that it's a book which will have lasting value. I mean, it's not something that will be read just now, but even later, which is something which makes me happy. The book has also been translated into Tamil. This is the Marathi translation. It is, in fact, before the Marathi translation, it was translated into Tamil which is not surprising, maybe, because there is a strong Dalit Bahujan movement in Tamil Nadu, and there are people who read English. So people read the book in English and felt it needed to be translated into Tamil. Now I have people working on the Kannada translation and Hindi as well. And somebody in Bengal has also expressed a little bit of interest. But so, just to conclude, I mean, the book was important for me because I started a certain kind of writing which was more creative on a slightly larger scale, which is something I'd always wanted to do. Now, I find that even the academic articles I write have a different style, and so that's what I have gained. Meeting people who have read my book and liked it is always a great experience for a writer. That's why I'm also happy that Begumpura Productions has decided to interview me on this book. I hope this will also help the news to reach more people. Thank you.